MASH was one of the most beloved television shows of all time. For 11 seasons, audiences tuned in to watch the doctors and nurses of the 4077th Mobile Army Surgical Hospital save lives in the Korean War. But what nobody talks about is why so many of the show's most important actors eventually left. Some walked away at the height of the show's popularity. Others fought bitter battles with producers. A few refused to ever speak about their time on set again. The reasons they left weren't what anyone expected. And the truth about what really happened behind the scenes has been kept quiet for decades. What made these actors abandon a show that was making them famous? Jamie Farr played Corporal Maxwell Q. Klinger on MASH, and by the time the show ended in 1983, he had become one of the most recognizable faces on television. But getting to that point required him to endure something that almost broke him. The character of Klinger was supposed to be comedic relief. A soldier who dressed in women's clothing in an attempt to get discharged from the army. It sounds simple enough, but what happened on set, day after day, week after week, was far more complicated and painful than anyone watching at home could have imagined. Jamie Farr arrived on the show as a guest star in the early seasons. He was supposed to appear in just a handful of episodes, but the character resonated with audiences in unexpected ways. People laughed, yes, but they also felt something deeper. Klinger was trapped. He was using humor and absurdity as a survival mechanism in an impossible situation. That combination of comedy and genuine pathos made the character unforgettable. So the network made a decision. Klinger would become a regular cast member. Jamie Farr would stay for the long run. What nobody told Jamie Farr was that this decision would cost him his sense of self. Playing the same character, wearing the same dresses, delivering the same style of jokes, day after day for years, created a psychological strain that he wasn't prepared for. Audiences loved Klinger so much that they stopped seeing Jamie Farr. They saw only the character. Strangers on the street would approach him expecting him to be funny, to be Klinger, to perform even in his private life. He couldn't go to a restaurant without people staring. He couldn't walk through an airport without being recognized. And whenever he was recognized, people wanted the same thing. They wanted him to be Klinger. The problem deepened as the show went on. Jamie Farr was a serious actor. He wanted to do dramatic work. He wanted to challenge himself. He wanted to grow as a performer. But the more successful Klinger became, the more impossible it was for him to do anything else. He was trapped by his own success. Every audition for a dramatic role came with an asterisk. Casting directors saw Jamie Farr, but they thought Klinger. His identity had been consumed by the character. What made this situation even harder was that the show's creator, Larry Gelbart, had very specific ideas about how Klinger should be played. Gelbart was a comedic genius, but he was also demanding and controlling. He didn't want Jamie Farr to explore the deeper, more vulnerable sides of Klinger. He wanted jokes. He wanted broad comedy. He wanted the character to remain a punchline. When Jamie Farr tried to bring more nuance to scenes, when he attempted to find moments of genuine emotion, Gelbart would push back. The scripts would be rewritten to remove the depth and replace it with easier laughs. By the middle of the show's run, Jamie Farr was exhausted. He was emotionally depleted from playing the same character in the same way for so many years. He was frustrated by the lack of creative freedom. He was angry about the way the character was being written. And he was terrified that if the show ever ended, he would discover that Jamie Farr the actor no longer existed. There was only Klinger. That fear haunted him. What Jamie Farr eventually revealed, in interviews years after the show ended, was that he had considered leaving multiple times. He had seriously discussed walking away from the role, even at the height of the show's popularity. But he couldn't do it. The money was too good. The fame was too intoxicating. His contract made it impossible to leave without facing serious legal and financial consequences. So he stayed. He kept playing Klinger. And he kept a part of himself locked away, waiting for a day when he could finally be something more than a character in a dress. But Jamie Farr's struggle was just one example of how this show was destroying the people who made it successful. MASH was a comedy about a war. That contradiction was at the heart of everything the show did. It used humor to process trauma. It used laughter to make unbearable situations bearable. But what happened on the set of MASH was that this dynamic became twisted. Laughter stopped being therapeutic and started being cruel. The cast members used comedy as a weapon against each other. They used jokes to establish dominance. They used humor to deflect from real problems and real pain. And nobody called them out because, after all, it was just comedy, right? The tone on set was established from the beginning by the older, more experienced cast members. These were successful actors who had been in the industry for years. They had power. They had status. And they used that power to control the environment through humor. If someone made a mistake during filming, they would be mocked mercilessly. If a younger actor tried to suggest an idea, it would be shot down with a cutting joke. If someone was having a bad day and their performance suffered, they would be ridiculed in front of the entire crew. The message was clear. Weakness was not tolerated. Sensitivity was not welcome. The only acceptable response to pressure was to laugh it off. This created an incredibly toxic environment. Even though it looked festive and fun from the outside, cast members learned to hide their real feelings behind humor. They learned to deflect genuine concerns with jokes. They learned to suffer in silence rather than admit that something was wrong. A younger cast member who was struggling with depression couldn't ask for help because that would make them the target of jokes. An actress dealing with harassment couldn't speak up because her concerns would be minimized with humor. Everyone on set was performing not just for the cameras, but for each other, every single moment of every single day. What made this particularly damaging was that the cast members couldn't escape it. They lived in the same trailers. They ate meals together. They spent 12 to 14 hours a day on set. There was nowhere to go to get away from the constant pressure to be funny, to be tough, to not show weakness. One actor described it as being trapped in a comedy club where you never got to leave the stage. You were always on. You were always expected to deliver a laugh. And if you failed to do that, you became the joke. The producers and network executives loved this environment because it kept everyone in line. As long as the cast members were focused on entertaining each other with jokes and competitive humor, they weren't asking difficult questions about their working conditions. They weren't complaining about long hours or unsafe situations. They weren't unionizing or demanding better treatment. The humor was a distraction. It was a management tool, and it worked perfectly right up until it didn't. Several cast members who left the show revealed, years later, that the constant mockery and competitive humor had left psychological scars. One actress talked about how she had internalized the message that her concerns didn't matter. She had learned to laugh at herself before anyone else could. Another actor described how the constant pressure to be funny had made him afraid of silence. He couldn't be alone with his thoughts because the criticism in his head was too loud. A third performer revealed that they had developed anxiety issues from years of never knowing when they might become the target of a joke. What's particularly tragic is that this toxic use of humor could have been prevented. If the producers had established healthier boundaries, if they had created a space where people could be vulnerable without being mocked, if they had valued emotional well-being as much as they valued entertainment, things could have been different. But they didn't. And the cost of that failure was paid by the people who made the show work. The humor that made MASH beloved by audiences was being built on the pain and suffering of the cast members who performed it. And as the years went on, that toll became impossible to ignore. There's something fundamentally disturbing about making a comedy about war. MASH walked a tightrope between laughter and tragedy for 11 seasons. The show would make you laugh at a joke, and then immediately cut to a scene where soldiers were dying. It would present absurdity and horror in the same episode. Sometimes in the same scene. This tonal whiplash was part of what made the show brilliant. But it was also psychologically damaging to the cast members who had to perform it every single day. Imagine being an actor on MASH. You're filming a comedic scene. You're making jokes. You're getting laughs from the crew. The energy is light and playful. Then, without warning, the script shifts. Suddenly you're in a surgical tent watching fake blood and fake bodies. Suddenly you're playing a scene where your character is telling a wounded soldier that he's going to die. Suddenly the comedy is gone and you're standing in the middle of genuine human tragedy. And you have to make that transition instantaneously. You have to go from joking to crying, from entertaining to devastating. Over and over again, the show's creator, Larry Gelbart, understood the power of this contrast intellectually. He knew that mixing comedy and drama created emotional impact. But what he didn't seem to fully grasp was the psychological toll it took on the performers. The cast members weren't robots who could switch emotions on command without experiencing any real consequences. They were human beings trying to navigate impossible emotional terrain every single day they went to work. One of the show's most respected actresses revealed that she developed a coping mechanism to survive. She would compartmentalize. She would deliberately separate the comedic scenes from the dramatic ones in her mind. She wouldn't allow herself to feel the emotions of the dramatic scenes deeply because she knew she had to turn around and be funny 5 minutes later. But this compartmentalization came at a cost. Over time, she found herself unable to access genuine emotion in her real life. She had trained herself not to feel deeply, and that skill didn't turn off when the cameras stopped rolling. She carried that emotional numbness into her personal relationships. Another cast member talked about the whiplash in terms of physical exhaustion. Your body doesn't understand the difference between real trauma and simulated trauma when you're performing at that level. Your adrenal system is triggered by scenes of death and violence, even when you know intellectually that it's fake. Your nervous system is activated. Your stress hormones spike, and then you're immediately asked to be funny. You're asked to tell a joke when your body is in a state of fight-or-flight response. That's a recipe for burnout and exhaustion. Over 11 seasons, that compounding stress created serious health issues for several cast members. What made this even more problematic was that the show was dealing with real historical trauma. The Korean War was a real conflict that killed millions of people. The medical procedures shown on MASH were based on actual military medicine. The situations the characters encountered were informed by real soldier experiences. So the cast members weren't just doing emotional gymnastics for entertainment. They were, in a sense, processing and performing real human suffering. They were using their bodies and their emotions to help audiences understand the reality of war. And they were doing it while also being expected to make people laugh. Several cast members, looking back on their time on the show, expressed guilt about this. They felt like they had been complicit in turning real suffering into entertainment. They worried that by making comedy out of war, they had somehow trivialized the actual experiences of real soldiers. One actor described it as a kind of moral injury. He wasn't physically wounded by the work, but something inside him had been damaged by the constant negotiation between laughter and tragedy. The show's brilliance came from this dark contradiction. But that brilliance exacted a price that most audiences never fully understood. The cast was paying that price every single day. Larry Gelbart created MASH, and in the early years he was celebrated as a comedic genius. He won Emmys. He won critical acclaim. He had creative control over one of the most important television shows in American history. But as the years went on, something changed. The power went to his head. Or maybe the stress of maintaining the show's quality wore him down. Either way, by the middle of the series run, Larry Gelbart had become someone the cast feared. He became a tyrant who controlled every aspect of the show with an iron fist, and he was willing to destroy careers and relationships to maintain that control. The first sign of the problem was how he treated writers. MASH had a talented writing staff, but Gelbart would rewrite almost everything they produced. He would take their scripts and completely overhaul them. He would erase their jokes and replace them with his own. He would change character moments and dialogue without explanation. Writers who had been with the show for years would submit scripts they had worked on for weeks, only to have Gelbart tear them apart in front of the entire room. It was humiliating. It was demoralizing. Several talented writers left the show because they couldn't work under those conditions anymore. But the writers weren't the only ones who suffered under Gelbart's control. The actors felt it too. He had very specific ideas about how scenes should be played. He didn't want actors to improvise or explore different interpretations. He wanted them to say the lines exactly as written and deliver them in exactly the way he had envisioned. When actors tried to suggest changes or bring their own ideas to scenes, Gelbart would shut them down immediately. He would make cutting comments about their abilities as performers. He would humiliate them in front of the crew. The message was clear. This was his show, and everyone else was just executing his vision. One of the show's leading actors eventually reached a breaking point. This performer had been with MASH since the beginning and had contributed significantly to the show's success. But Gelbart treated him like he was disposable. He would rewrite the actor's best scenes, cutting jokes that had gotten huge laughs and replacing them with weaker material. He would reduce the actor's screen time without explanation. He would make decisions about the character that contradicted what the actor had built over years of performance. When the actor finally confronted Gelbart about this treatment, Gelbart responded with anger and defensiveness. He made it clear that if the actor didn't like how things were being done, he could leave. The actor felt trapped. Leaving would mean walking away from a hit show and a lucrative contract. But staying meant continuing to work under someone who seemed to actively disrespect him. He chose to stay, but the damage to their professional relationship was irreparable. From that point on, there was tension every time they interacted. The actor performed his role professionally, but the joy was gone. The creativity was gone. He was just going through the motions. Another actress experienced similar treatment. She was playing a character that had become increasingly important to the show's dynamics. But Gelbart didn't seem to value her contributions the way he valued other cast members. Her scenes were often cut or rewritten. Her character storylines were abandoned in favor of focusing on other characters. She felt invisible on a show where she was supposed to be part of the core cast. The experience was incredibly damaging to her confidence as an actress. She began to wonder if she was actually talented or if she was just a supporting player in Gelbart's vision. What made Gelbart's tyranny particularly destructive was that he was creating an environment where fear replaced collaboration. Cast members were afraid to speak up about problems because they knew Gelbart would retaliate. Writers were afraid to be creative because they knew their work would be torn apart. Directors were afraid to suggest ideas because they knew Gelbart had final say on everything. The show was successful, but it was successful despite the toxic environment, not because of it. And the cost of that success was measured in broken relationships and damaged careers. Years later, when cast members and writers finally felt safe enough to speak about their experiences with Gelbart, many of them expressed regret about not standing up to him sooner. But they also understood why they hadn't. Power imbalances are difficult to resist. Fear is a powerful motivator. And in an industry like Hollywood, where your reputation and your relationships determine your future, challenging someone in Gelbart's position felt too risky. The tyranny was about to drive someone away from the show entirely. Sally Kellerman played Margaret Hot Lips Houlihan on MASH, and she was essential to the show's success. Her character was complex and multidimensional in ways that were rare for female characters on television in the 1970s. Margaret started as a somewhat antagonistic figure, but over time the audience came to understand and respect her. She was competent. She was vulnerable. She was human. Kellerman's performance made all of that possible. But her reward for creating one of television's most iconic female characters was mistreatment and disrespect from the very people who benefited from her talent. The problem started with how her character was written. Margaret was often portrayed as someone whose primary value was her sexuality. Scripts would emphasize her attractiveness. Scenes would focus on her romantic relationships. Her competence as a nurse was frequently overshadowed by jokes about her appearance or her personal life. Kellerman objected to this. She wanted Margaret to be respected as a professional. She wanted the character's medical expertise to be highlighted. She wanted scenes that showed her strength and capability. But when she voiced these concerns, she was dismissed. Gelbart, in particular, seemed resistant to Kellerman's suggestions about her own character. He would tell her that audiences didn't want to see Margaret as a serious nurse. They wanted to see her as a romantic interest. He would explain that the show's comedy depended on certain character dynamics, and changing Margaret's portrayal would undermine the show's formula. In other words, he was telling her that her value to the show was based on how attractive and desirable she was, not on her talent or her contributions to the storytelling. It was deeply disrespectful, but it was also difficult to push back against because Gelbart had the power to make her life on set very difficult. What made the situation worse was that the male cast members weren't receiving the same treatment. Their characters were allowed to grow and change. Their competence was celebrated. Their storylines explored depth and complexity. But Margaret remained trapped in a narrow characterization, despite Kellerman's efforts to expand and deepen the role. The double standard was impossible to ignore, and Kellerman eventually reached her limit. She made a decision that took tremendous courage. She would speak publicly about the sexism she was experiencing. In interviews, she began to talk about how her character was being written. She discussed the ways that female characters were undervalued on the show. She expressed frustration with the double standards that existed between how male and female performers were treated. She was professional in her criticism, but she was also honest and direct. She wasn't going to suffer in silence anymore. The response from Gelbart and the network was swift and punishing. Suddenly, there were conversations about whether Kellerman was a team player. Questions arose about whether she was difficult to work with. Rumors circulated that she was causing problems on set. The narrative shifted from Kellerman being a talented actress advocating for better material to Kellerman being a troublemaker who didn't understand how television worked. The industry's response to a woman asking for respect and equal treatment was to punish her for it. By the time Kellerman decided to leave the show, the damage to her career had already been done. She had established herself as someone who would stand up for what she believed in, which should have been admirable. But in Hollywood, that quality is often punished, especially in women. Future casting directors would remember that she had been difficult on MASH. Future producers would think twice about hiring someone who might challenge them on creative decisions. Kellerman had sacrificed her position on one of the most successful shows on television to advocate for respect, and the industry had responded by making it harder for her to work. What makes this story particularly tragic is that Kellerman was right. Looking back at MASH now, viewers can see that Margaret Houlihan was constrained by sexist writing and limited characterization. Kellerman's instincts about what the character could have been were sound. She was advocating for better storytelling and more authentic characterization. She was pushing back against sexism, and she was punished for it. Her departure from the show wasn't a creative choice. It was a forced exit orchestrated by people who couldn't tolerate being challenged by a woman. The network quickly recast the role with a different actress, and the show moved forward without missing a beat. But the message had been sent to every woman working in television. Speak up about unfair treatment, and you'll pay the price. Stay quiet, compromise your values, and you'll keep your job. It was a cruel choice to present to someone who had given so much to make the show successful. But Kellerman's departure wasn't the end of the exodus from MASH. Others were about to make equally difficult decisions. In the early days of television, there was an unwritten social contract between networks and actors. The network would provide steady work and reasonable compensation. In exchange, actors would be professional and committed to the show. But more importantly, networks understood that they had a responsibility to protect their performers. If an actor was struggling with personal problems, the network would try to help. If an actor needed time off for health reasons, accommodations would be made. If an actor was dealing with harassment or mistreatment, the network would intervene. It wasn't always perfect, but the principle was clear. The network had some obligation to look out for the people who made their programs. By the time MASH was in its later seasons, that unwritten contract had been completely abandoned. The network viewed the cast as interchangeable parts in a machine designed to generate profit. An actor's personal struggles were irrelevant. Health issues were an inconvenience. Requests for time off or accommodations were treated as unreasonable demands. The network's attitude was simple. If you can't handle the job, we'll find someone who can. And there were always other actors who would be desperate to take your place. One cast member who had been dealing with serious personal problems reached out to network executives asking for support. This actor was going through a difficult time in their personal life and was struggling to maintain focus on the job. They weren't asking to leave the show. They weren't asking for special treatment. They were simply asking for understanding and perhaps some flexibility in their schedule while they dealt with their problems. The network's response was cold and dismissive. They told the actor that everyone had personal problems, and that wasn't an excuse for not performing at the highest level. They made it clear that if the actor couldn't handle the pressure, they should consider leaving. The actor was devastated by this response. They had given years to the show. They had been professional and committed. And when they needed basic human compassion, they were met with indifference. The experience taught them that the network didn't care about them as people. They only cared about the product. The actor eventually decided to leave the show, not because they wanted to, but because they couldn't survive in an environment where their well-being was so completely disregarded. Another actress experienced a different kind of broken contract. She had been promised, when she was hired, that her character would have opportunities to grow and develop over time. She was told that her role would become increasingly important as the show progressed. But as years went by, her character remained static. The promised storylines never materialized. The opportunities for growth never came. When she asked network executives about this, she was told that plans had changed. The network had decided to focus on other characters. Her role would remain as it was. The actress felt betrayed. She had made career choices based on promises that the network had now broken. What was particularly cruel about breaking these unwritten rules was that it left actors with no recourse. If the network violated the explicit terms of their contracts, actors could sue. But these unwritten understandings, these implicit promises of support and opportunity, had no legal standing. An actor couldn't go to court and argue that the network had failed to treat them with basic human compassion. There was no legal mechanism to enforce promises that had never been written down. So actors were left to suffer in silence, knowing they had been betrayed, but unable to do anything about it. One of the show's most respected performers eventually spoke about this breach of the unwritten contract. He described feeling like he had been used. The network had extracted years of work from him, built the show's success partly on his contributions, and then forgotten about any obligation to treat him fairly. He felt disposable. He felt betrayed. And most painfully, he felt foolish for having believed that the network actually cared about him as a person. The network's abandonment of these unwritten rules had a cascading effect. Cast members became less trusting. They stopped believing that their employers had their best interests in mind. They started looking out for themselves because they knew the network wasn't going to do it. They became more cynical, more guarded, more focused on protecting themselves than on collaborating creatively. The toxic environment that had been building throughout the show's run deepened even further. What nobody anticipated was that this erosion of trust and mutual responsibility would eventually make the show itself harder to make. When people stop believing that their employer cares about them, they stop caring about the work in the same way. Wayne Rogers played Captain B.J. Honeycutt on MASH, and his departure from the show after 5 seasons shocked everyone. The character was central to the show. B.J. was the emotional heart of many episodes. Rogers' performance had made the character beloved by audiences. So why did he leave? The official story was that he wanted to pursue other opportunities. He wanted to do film work. He wanted to challenge himself with different roles. All of that was technically true, but it wasn't the whole truth. The real reason Wayne Rogers left MASH was far more complicated and painful. Rogers had signed a contract to play B.J. Honeycutt for a specific number of years. But as the show became increasingly successful, and as the network realized how valuable the character was, they wanted to extend his contract. Rogers was open to staying, but only if certain conditions were met. He wanted better compensation. He wanted more creative input into his character's storylines. He wanted a say in the direction the character would take. These were reasonable requests from a performer who had helped build the show's success. But the network refused to negotiate. The network's position was that Rogers was replaceable. They believed that audiences watched MASH because of the show's concept and writing, not because of any specific actor. If Rogers wanted to leave, they would simply hire another actor to play B.J. Rogers would be forgotten. Someone new would take his place, and the show would continue without missing a beat. The network made it clear that they weren't interested in accommodating Rogers' requests. Take it or leave it was their message. Rogers was faced with an impossible choice. He could stay under the existing terms, which he felt undervalued his contributions and denied him creative control over his own character. Or he could leave and risk being labeled as someone who had walked away from a successful show. Either way, his career would suffer. But Rogers decided that his integrity mattered more than his career. He decided that he wouldn't compromise his values to stay on a show where he wasn't respected. So he left. What nobody knew at the time was how much that decision cost him emotionally. Rogers had loved playing BJ. He had developed a real attachment to the character. He had ideas about where the character could go, storylines he wanted to explore, moments he wanted to play. Walking away meant abandoning all of that. It meant giving up the opportunity to finish the character's journey in a way that felt satisfying to him. But he couldn't stay under conditions that denied him basic professional respect. The network quickly hired Mike Farrell to replace Rogers as Captain BJ Honeycutt. Farrell was a talented actor, and he did excellent work with the role. But here's the thing, audiences didn't forget Wayne Rogers. Many longtime viewers continued to think of Rogers' version of BJ as the definitive one. The network's theory that any actor could fill the role proved to be incorrect. Rogers was irreplaceable not because of his ego, but because of the specific contributions he had made to the character and the show. Years later, Rogers was asked in an interview why he had left MASH. He was honest about it. He talked about the network's refusal to respect him as a professional. He talked about his need to maintain his integrity. He talked about how painful it had been to walk away from a show he loved. And he expressed some regret about the decision, not because he had been wrong to leave, but because he wished the network had valued him enough to negotiate with him. He wished they had recognized that his contributions mattered. He wished they had treated him with the basic professional respect that any serious performer deserved. What Rogers' departure revealed was that the network's approach to dealing with cast members was ultimately self-defeating. By refusing to negotiate with Rogers, by making it clear that they viewed actors as replaceable commodities, they had created a situation where a talented performer felt he had no choice but to leave. The network could have kept Rogers by simply treating him fairly. But they chose confrontation instead. And in doing so, they lost one of the show's most important creative voices. Rogers' departure should have been a wake-up call to the network. It should have shown them that their approach to managing talent was creating unnecessary conflict and losing valuable people. But instead of learning that lesson, the network doubled down on the same approach with other cast members. One of the show's most dedicated performers decided to use method acting as a way to bring authenticity to his portrayal of a surgeon working in a combat hospital. The actor researched actual military medicine. He spent time with real surgeons. He studied the emotional toll that this kind of work took on medical professionals. He wanted to understand his character at the deepest possible level so that he could deliver performances that felt completely authentic. It was admirable in theory, but in practice it became a form of self-torture that nearly destroyed him. The actor began spending hours in the show's surgical set between takes, studying the equipment and the procedures. He would watch documentaries about the Korean War late into the night. He would read accounts from real surgeons who had worked in field hospitals. He would interview medical professionals about the trauma they experienced. He was trying to live the emotional reality of his character every moment of every day. What started as research became an obsession. What was supposed to help him deliver better performances became a psychological burden that he couldn't put down. The problem with method acting, especially in the context of a show about war and trauma, is that you can't just turn it off when the cameras stop rolling. The actor had trained his mind and body to be in a constant state of stress and emotional activation. He was living as if he were actually a military surgeon dealing with life and death situations every single day. His nervous system was in overdrive. His stress hormones were constantly elevated. He was sleeping poorly because his mind couldn't shut down. His personal relationships suffered because he was emotionally unavailable outside of work. He was disappearing into a character in a way that made it impossible for him to maintain his own sense of self. Other cast members noticed the change in him. He became withdrawn. He was less social on set. He seemed perpetually exhausted and anxious. When they tried to reach out and check on him, he would deflect with vague explanations about his commitment to the role. He didn't want sympathy or intervention. He wanted to continue the method acting process, even though it was clearly harming him. The cast members felt helpless. They could see that something was wrong, but the actor was resistant to admitting it or seeking help. The network and producers, meanwhile, were thrilled. The actor's performances were incredibly powerful and emotionally authentic. He was delivering some of the show's most moving scenes. The fact that he was achieving this through a process that was destructive to his mental health was irrelevant to them. They weren't interested in his well-being. They were interested in the quality of the performance. If method acting was producing great results, then method acting was good. The consequences for the actor's health were his problem, not theirs. It took a health crisis for the actor to finally step back from the method acting process. He experienced physical symptoms that frightened him enough to seek medical attention. A doctor explained that chronic stress and anxiety were taking a toll on his body. His blood pressure was dangerously high. He was at risk of a heart attack or stroke. He needed to make significant changes to reduce his stress levels. That medical reality finally broke through the actor's commitment to the method acting process. He couldn't maintain his artistic integrity if he was dead. The actor eventually found a way to perform his role effectively without the self-destructive method acting techniques. He learned that he could access the emotional truth of a character without sacrificing his own mental and physical health. But the damage from years of intense method acting had already been done. He dealt with anxiety and stress-related health issues for years afterward. He struggled with the line between his character and himself. It took considerable time and effort to reclaim his own identity after having submerged it so completely in the character. Looking back on this period, the actor expressed anger not at himself for taking the method acting too far, but at the system that had encouraged it. The network and producers had benefited enormously from his self-destructive behavior. They had gotten incredible performances. They had won awards and accolades partly because of the emotional authenticity he was bringing to the role. But they had never once expressed concern about the cost to him personally. They had never suggested that maybe his health was more important than perfect performances. They had simply harvested the benefits of his suffering. This actor's experience with method acting became a cautionary tale for other performers on the show and in the industry. It demonstrated the dangers of losing yourself completely in a role. It showed what happens when a system values the product more than it values the people making that product. By the middle of MASH's run, several cast members were facing a choice that seemed to have no good answer. On one side was continued success. The show was one of the most popular programs on television. The cast members were becoming household names. They were making good money. They had job security for as long as the show continued. They had achieved a level of fame that most actors spend their entire careers trying to reach. On the other side was their mental health, their personal relationships, their sense of identity, and their ability to do work that felt meaningful and creatively fulfilling. But they couldn't have both. The price of fame was sacrificing everything else. The fame itself became a kind of prison. Cast members couldn't go anywhere without being recognized. They couldn't have private moments. They couldn't make mistakes without those mistakes becoming public knowledge. Their personal lives were constantly fodder for gossip columns and fan magazines. If they were spotted with someone romantically, the tabloids would speculate about their relationship. If they looked tired or sad in public, people would write stories about their supposed struggles. Their privacy had been completely erased. They were public property. One actress described what it was like to lose her anonymity. She couldn't go to a grocery store without being approached by fans wanting autographs or photos. She couldn't sit in a restaurant without people staring at her or taking pictures with their phones. She couldn't have a conversation with a friend without strangers interrupting to talk about the show. The relentless nature of the attention was exhausting. She found herself avoiding public spaces. She became isolated. She spent more and more time at home, away from crowds, away from the scrutiny. But isolation had its own psychological costs. Another cast member talked about the pressure of maintaining an image. The network and studio had invested in building his public persona. He was supposed to be charming and charismatic at all times. He was supposed to be available to fans and the press. He was supposed to maintain a certain image in public that matched the character audiences loved. But he wasn't that person all the time. Sometimes he was tired. Sometimes he was sad. Sometimes he was angry or frustrated. But he couldn't show those sides of himself publicly because it would contradict the image he was supposed to project. So he developed a performance of himself, a public persona that was separate from his actual self. Living that double life was psychologically exhausting. The most insidious part of the choice between fame and sanity was that it seemed impossible to opt out. If you tried to withdraw from the public eye, the studio would pressure you to be more available. If you refused interviews or public appearances, you were labeled as difficult or ungrateful. If you tried to reclaim your privacy, you were accused of being arrogant or thinking you were too good for your fans. The system had constructed a situation where there was no acceptable way to say no. Fame demanded constant sacrifice, and refusing to sacrifice was treated as a betrayal of the fans and the show. Some cast members tried to find a middle ground. They would limit their public appearances to certain events. They would set boundaries around their availability. But these boundaries were constantly being pushed and tested. A fan magazine would demand an exclusive interview. The network would request that an actor appear at a promotional event. The studio would pressure someone to do a photo shoot. The requests never stopped. And saying no to any of them came with social and professional consequences. One performer eventually made a radical decision. He decided to step back from the public eye almost entirely. He stopped doing interviews. He avoided public events whenever possible. He declined photo opportunities and autograph sessions. He essentially tried to reclaim his anonymity by refusing to participate in the machinery of celebrity. The backlash was immediate and harsh. Fans felt betrayed by his withdrawal. The press wrote negative stories about his apparent arrogance. The network was furious about his refusal to promote the show. His decision to prioritize his own mental health was treated as a personal failing. But the actor persisted. He decided that his sanity was worth the professional consequences. He accepted that he might be labeled as difficult or ungrateful. He accepted that some opportunities might be closed off to him. What he wouldn't accept was continuing to sacrifice his mental health and his sense of self on the altar of celebrity. Looking back years later, he expressed no regret about that decision. He acknowledged that it had cost him certain opportunities, but it had also saved his life. He had reclaimed his identity. He had reclaimed his privacy. He had reclaimed his ability to be a whole person rather than just a public persona. This choice between maintaining the appearance and reality of fame versus protecting mental health and identity became the defining struggle for several MASH cast members. And it was a choice that the system had forced upon them, not one they would have chosen for themselves. MASH was so successful that it eventually became impossible for the show to evolve or change in meaningful ways. In the early seasons, the writers and producers had creative freedom to experiment. They could try different approaches to storytelling. They could take risks. They could fail and learn from those failures. But as the show became more popular and more profitable, that creative freedom slowly disappeared. Every decision became calculated based on what had worked before. Every episode was compared to previous successes. The show became locked into a formula, and that formula became a cage. The network's logic was simple and brutal. If something works, repeat it. The formula that had made MASH successful in seasons 1 and 2 should be repeated in seasons 3 and 4. The jokes that got laughs should be used again and again. The character dynamics that resonated with audiences should remain unchanged. Innovation was risky. Innovation might alienate viewers. Innovation might hurt ratings. So the show stopped innovating. It stopped taking risks. It became increasingly predictable and repetitive. The cast members felt this creative suffocation acutely. They had signed on to do something fresh and different, but they found themselves trapped in a show that was essentially repeating the same stories and the same character beats over and over again. The scripts became formulaic. The character arcs became predictable. The situations the characters found themselves in started to feel recycled. An actor might protest, suggesting a new direction for their character or a different kind of storyline. But the response would be the same: we can't change what's working. The audience loves this character as they are. Don't fix what isn't broken. What made this particularly frustrating was that the cast members were sophisticated performers who wanted to challenge themselves. They wanted to grow as actors. They wanted to explore different dimensions of their characters. But the show's success had created a situation where they were actively prevented from doing that. Their characters couldn't change too much because change might confuse the audience or alienate loyal viewers. Their storylines had to follow established patterns because deviation from those patterns might hurt ratings. They were trapped in amber, frozen in time, unable to evolve or develop. One veteran actor described it as being locked in a prison of success. He was grateful for the show's popularity and the opportunities it had provided. But he also felt like he was suffocating. He had played the same character in the same way for so many years that he was afraid he had lost the ability to play anything else. If the show ever ended, he worried that he would discover that he no longer knew how to challenge himself as a performer. The success that should have opened doors was actually closing them. It was creating a situation where he became increasingly typecast and less marketable for other kinds of roles. This creative stagnation also affected the writers. The most talented writers eventually left because they wanted to work on projects where they could innovate and take risks. They didn't want to spend their careers writing variations on established formulas. So the show lost its most creative voices, and the writing quality declined as a result. The irony was that the network's conservative approach to protecting the show's success actually contributed to its eventual decline. The producers felt the creative suffocation as well. They wanted to make bold choices. They wanted to push the show in new directions. But they were constantly constrained by the network's fear of changing anything that might jeopardize ratings or revenue. They had to fight for every small creative choice. They had to justify every deviation from the established formula. The energy that should have gone into creating brilliant television was instead spent negotiating with network executives who were terrified of taking risks. What the cast and crew came to understand was that the show's greatest success was also its greatest curse. MASH had become so popular, so profitable, and so culturally important that it was frozen in place. Couldn't evolve. Couldn't take risks. It couldn't push boundaries or explore new territory. It had to remain exactly what it had been in order to protect its commercial value. And in doing so, it stopped being the kind of creative endeavor that attracted talented people who wanted to do meaningful work. Those people left. They went to other projects where they could innovate. And MASH was left with people who either accepted the creative stagnation or were too trapped by circumstances to leave. But the creative death of the show was just a symptom of a larger organizational death that was about to become impossible to ignore. In the final seasons of MASH, the network made a decision that felt like the ultimate betrayal to many cast members. They decided that the show would end on their timeline, not when the story naturally concluded or when the cast and crew felt ready. The network had done the math. They knew how long they could stretch the show before audiences started to lose interest. They knew the exact moment when ratings would begin to decline. And they decided that the show would end right before that happened, at the absolute peak of its popularity. It was a purely financial calculation disguised as a creative decision. The problem was that the cast and crew weren't consulted about this decision. They didn't get to vote on whether the show should continue. They didn't get to have input into how or when the story would conclude. The network simply announced that Season 11 would be the final season. The cast learned about it through press releases and network announcements, not through private conversations with executives who valued their opinions. They learned that their jobs would be ending, that the show they had devoted years of their lives to would be concluding, not because it felt right creatively, but because the network had calculated that this was the optimal moment to end it for maximum profit. What made this decision particularly cruel was its timing. Several cast members had been holding on, enduring the difficult working conditions and creative frustration, because they believed they would eventually be able to leave on their own terms. They thought that when they felt ready, or when the show naturally ran its course, they would be able to make a graceful exit. But the network had taken that choice away from them. They had decided the ending without input from the people who would be most affected by it. One actress described learning about the final season announcement as a punch to the gut. She had been suffering through the show's later years, compromising her values and sacrificing her well-being, because she thought it would all lead to something meaningful. She thought that eventually the show would reach a natural conclusion where the characters' stories would be told in a satisfying way. But instead, she learned that the ending would be dictated by network executives' profit projections. The characters' fates would be determined not by storytelling logic but by financial calculations. It was deeply demoralizing. The cast tried to advocate for input into how the show would end. They asked for the opportunity to sit down with producers and discuss what kind of conclusion would be meaningful for their characters. They wanted to have some say in how their characters' stories would be concluded. The network's response was to shut down those conversations. The ending would be decided by the producers and the network. The cast would show up and perform what they were asked to perform. Their opinions about how their own characters should conclude their journeys were irrelevant. This refusal to include the cast in decisions about the show's conclusion crystallized something that had been building throughout the production. It made clear, in unmistakable terms, that the cast were not valued as collaborators or creative partners. They were employees. They were tools to be used and then discarded. Their years of commitment to the show, their emotional investment in the characters, their contributions to the show's success. None of that mattered. What mattered was maximizing profit. What mattered was ending the show at precisely the right moment to preserve its legacy and its financial value. Several cast members made a decision in that moment. They would not renew their contracts for any additional work beyond the final season. They would not do reunion specials or made-for-TV movies. They would not participate in promotional events for the show's conclusion. When the final episode aired, they were done. They were finished with MASH. Not because they didn't love the show or their characters, but because they had finally reached their breaking point. The network had betrayed them one too many times. They had had enough. One performer who had been with the show since the beginning actually became emotional when he talked about this period years later. He described it as a profound disappointment. He had invested so much of himself in this show. He had sacrificed years of his life. He had endured difficult working conditions and compromised his values. And in return, he had been treated as a disposable commodity by a network that viewed him only as a means to an end. The final betrayal of being excluded from decisions about the show's conclusion was the thing that broke him. It was the moment when he finally accepted that the network would never respect him or value his contributions. The only thing to do was to leave. The irony is that the cast's collective anger and betrayal actually created the emotional authenticity that made the show's final episodes so powerful and moving. The cast brought real heartbreak and real loss to their performances because they were actually experiencing heartbreak and loss. They were grieving the end of something that had defined their lives, even as they resented the way that end had been decided. But before the final chapter could be written, the cast would have one more shock waiting for them. After MASH ended in 1983, the cast scattered in different directions. Some pursued film careers. Some moved into television production or directing. Some stepped back from the entertainment industry altogether. But what's remarkable about almost all of them is what they didn't do. They didn't write tell-all memoirs exposing the dark side of the show. They didn't give bitter interviews to the press complaining about their treatment. They didn't participate in documentaries that would have revealed what really happened behind the scenes. For years, for decades, in some cases they stayed silent. And that silence itself tells an important part of the story. Part of the reason for this silence was practical. Several cast members went on to work with producers, networks, and studios that were connected to the people who had mistreated them on MASH. To speak out publicly would have been career suicide. You don't publicly criticize the people who control the industry you're trying to work in. You don't burn bridges with powerful executives. You don't rock the boat. So the cast members kept quiet. They compartmentalized their experiences. They moved forward with their careers as if the difficult years on MASH hadn't happened. Another reason for the silence was shame. Several cast members felt ashamed that they hadn't stood up for themselves more forcefully. They felt like they had compromised their values by staying on a show under conditions they knew were wrong. They felt guilty for not protecting other cast members who were suffering. They felt regret about not fighting harder for creative control or better treatment. When you're carrying that kind of shame, you don't want to talk about the situation. You want to forget about it. You want to move on and pretend it never happened. The silence was a way of managing that shame. But there was also a deeper reason for the silence. Many cast members were genuinely conflicted about their time on MASH. Yes, the working conditions had been difficult. Yes, they had been mistreated. Yes, they had experienced creative frustration and personal suffering. But they had also been part of something extraordinary. The show had touched millions of people. It had mattered culturally. It had changed television. Despite everything that had gone wrong behind the scenes, the final product was genuinely excellent. How do you talk about that contradiction? How do you say that you regret the experience and also recognize its importance and value? That's complicated. That's messy. That doesn't fit neatly into a narrative of victimhood or triumph. So many cast members simply chose not to talk about it at all. One actress eventually broke the silence. In an interview decades after the show ended, she talked openly about her experiences. She discussed the sexism she had experienced. She discussed the way her character had been limited by outdated writing. She discussed her decision to leave and the professional consequences that had followed. Her willingness to speak about these things was met with a mix of responses. Some people thanked her for finally telling the truth. Others criticized her for speaking negatively about such a beloved show. But her courage in breaking the silence opened a door. Other cast members gradually began to share their experiences as well. A male cast member who had left the show early gave an interview where he talked about why he had walked away. He discussed his struggle with the loss of privacy and autonomy. He discussed his need to maintain his integrity even when it cost him professionally. He discussed the network's refusal to negotiate with him. His honesty about these things was refreshing and painful to hear. It gave permission to other cast members to be honest about their own struggles. Over time, a more complete picture emerged. Not all at once, but through scattered interviews and occasional references in memoirs, the real story of what happened on MASH began to surface. The cast members, now in their later years or having established themselves in other careers, felt safer speaking about their experiences. The people who had mistreated them had retired or passed away. The industry had changed enough that speaking out didn't carry the same professional risks it once had. And perhaps most importantly, the cast members had finally processed their experiences enough to talk about them without being overwhelmed by anger or shame. What emerged from their collective testimony was a picture of a show that had achieved greatness despite tremendous obstacles and human cost. The cast had sacrificed their mental health, their privacy, their sense of self, and their creative fulfillment to create something that mattered. The network had exploited them. The producers had controlled them. The system had valued them only insofar as they generated profit. But despite all of that, the show had become a classic. It had influenced television and culture. It had meant something real to millions of people. The cast members who eventually spoke about their experiences expressed a complex mix of emotions. Gratitude for the opportunity and the impact they had made. Anger at how they had been treated. Sadness about the years lost to suffering. Recognition of what they had accomplished. Regret about what they had sacrificed. There was no simple narrative that could contain all of these feelings. The truth about their time on MASH was complicated and contradictory, just like the show itself. What they finally revealed, through their collective willingness to be honest about their experiences, was that entertainment has a human cost. That success doesn't erase suffering. That a great product can be built on the backs of people who are being exploited. That an industry can value output while devaluing the people producing that output. And that sometimes the most important thing a person can do is finally tell the truth about their experiences, even if it takes decades to feel safe enough to do so. MASH ended on February 28, 1983, with a 2.5-hour finale that became one of the most watched television events in American history. Over 125 million people tuned in to say goodbye to the 4077th Mobile Army Surgical Hospital. The finale was brilliant. It was emotionally devastating. It provided closure to storylines that had been developing for 11 seasons. It sent the characters home. It ended the war. It was everything the cast and crew had wanted the show's conclusion to be. And it was bittersweet in ways that had nothing to do with the story on screen. For the cast members watching their work come to an end, The finale represented both an ending and a beginning. It was an ending to years of suffering, difficult working conditions, creative frustration, and personal sacrifice. But it was also the beginning of their lives after MASH. For some of them, that would mean moving on to successful careers in other areas of entertainment. For others, it would mean stepping away from the industry altogether. And for a few, it would mean spending decades processing what they had experienced and eventually finding the courage to talk about it. The show's legacy is undeniable. MASH revolutionized television comedy. It proved that you could make people laugh while also making them think about serious issues. It showed that a comedy could have emotional depth and real stakes. It demonstrated that television could be both entertaining and meaningful. Future shows learned from MASH. Writers studied it. Producers tried to replicate its success. The influence of MASH on television is still visible today, 40 years after it ended. But the show's legacy is also complicated by what we now know about the cost of making it. We know that cast members suffered. We know that the working environment was toxic in many ways. We know that the network prioritized profit over people. We know that talented performers were mistreated and undervalued. We know that the show's success came at a significant human cost. How do we reconcile that knowledge with our love for the show itself? The answer is that we have to hold both truths simultaneously. MASH was a great show. It was also made under conditions that were often exploitative and harmful. Both things are true. We can celebrate what the cast and crew accomplished while also acknowledging what they sacrificed. We can appreciate the artistic achievement while also recognizing the human cost. We can love the show without ignoring or minimizing the pain of the people who made it. One of the cast members, reflecting on the show years later, expressed this contradiction beautifully. He said that he would never take back his time on MASH. Despite everything that happened, despite all the suffering and frustration and compromise, he was proud of the work. He was proud of what they had created together. But he also said that he wouldn't wish the experience on anyone. The cost had been too high. The suffering had been too deep. If he could go back and make a different choice, he wasn't sure what he would do. That uncertainty, that inability to fully regret something that also caused so much pain, is the true legacy of MASH. The show demonstrated something important about the entertainment industry that remains true today. Success and suffering are not mutually exclusive. You can create something brilliant while also being exploited. You can achieve great things while also sacrificing your well-being. You can touch millions of people while also feeling invisible and undervalued by the people who employ you. The industry's structure is such that these contradictions are built in. Excellence is extracted through pressure and control. Greatness is achieved through sacrifice. The cast members who eventually spoke about their experiences wanted to change that dynamic. They wanted future generations of performers to understand what they had experienced and to demand better treatment. They wanted the industry to recognize that you don't have to exploit people to create excellent entertainment. You don't have to sacrifice human well-being to achieve artistic success. You don't have to choose between caring about people and creating great work. Those things can coexist. But the industry has been slow to learn these lessons. Even today, decades after MASH ended, performers speak about exploitative working conditions. They talk about networks and studios that prioritize profit over people. They describe toxic environments where creative people are treated as disposable commodities. The dynamics that made MASH difficult to make are still present in entertainment today. The cast of MASH suffered so that future performers might have a cautionary tale. But change has been slow. What the cast members want us to understand is that entertainment has a human cost. When you watch a great show or movie, you're watching the result of countless hours of work by people who may have sacrificed their health, their relationships, their sense of self to create that work. We should appreciate their contributions. We should celebrate their achievements. But we should also demand better. We should expect that the people creating our entertainment are treated fairly. We should insist that success doesn't require suffering. We should hold the industry accountable for valuing people as much as we value the products they create. The cast of MASH finally spoke their truth decades after the show ended. They told us what really happened behind the scenes. They revealed the cost of creating something that we all loved. And in doing so, they gave us the opportunity to see entertainment differently, to see the human beings behind the performances, to recognize the sacrifice, to demand that future performers don't have to pay the same price. That's the real legacy of MASH. Not just a great television show, but a cautionary tale about what happens when we value success more than we value people. And a reminder that change is possible if we're willing to listen to the voices of those who have suffered, and bold enough to demand something better. Now that you know what really happened behind the scenes of MASH, does it change how you feel about the show? Do you think the cast made the right decisions? Should they have walked away sooner? Or was it worth it to create something that mattered so much to so many people? What would you have done in their position? Let me know in the comments what you think about the real cost of making great television. And if you know other stories about beloved shows with dark behind-the-scenes histories, share them too. Because these conversations matter. They matter because they remind us that the people behind the entertainment we love deserve to be treated with respect and dignity. They deserve to have their voices heard. And they deserve better than what the industry has traditionally given them.